Have you asked yourself why so many adopted children feel the need to know where they came from? Even when raised in a loving environment by their adopted families, many still want to meet their biological parents. The truth is that knowing who we are often requires knowing where we came from. That might be the role that the book of Genesis plays in the history of redemption. God gave us Genesis so we know where we human beings came from. In the first two chapters of Genesis, we find the account of the beginning of the universe and especially of the beautiful world God created for humans to inhabit. Most importantly, Genesis describes in vivid detail the creation of humankind in God's image and likeness. Genesis also reveals the source of all the sin and evil that plague humankind. Chapter 3 recounts how humankind fell into sin. Sin's devastating effects are introduced immediately after, in chapter 4, as one of Adam and Eve's sons murder his younger brother. In chapter 5, the genealogy of death reminds us that sin and death are forever connected as cause and effect. Finally, in chapter 6, sin reaches its climax as evil and violence became humankind's all encompassing experience. Fortunately, Genesis also introduces us to God's nature and God's acts, to his justice and grace. In the destructive power of the flood, the confusion of Babel, and the fiery extermination of Sodom and Gomorrah, we are given glimpses of God's righteous judgment over sin. However, in the ancient promise of a coming Savior, in the deliverance provided by the ark, and the assurance granted in Noah's covenant, in the glorious promises of his covenant with Abraham, and even in the journey of Jacob's family to be fully supplied in Egypt, God repeatedly reveals his love and grace.
Allow me to share with you some background information. I do realize that some of you will be more interested in this information than others, but hopefully you'll all benefit from it. Let's start with the title of the book. The title, Genesis, as we have in our English Bibles, comes from the 3rd century BC Greek translation of the Hebrew text, also known as the Septuagint. It means origin, birth, or even generation. The Hebrew title follows a pattern very common throughout the Hebrew Bible, and the title is simply the first word of the text, the Hebrew word bereshti, not sure about my Hebrew pronunciation here, and it's often translated as in the beginning. So while the Hebrew title follows this pattern that I have mentioned before of naming the book by the first word of the book, the Greek title refers to the content of the book because the book, as its name indicates, contains many narratives of things coming to existence or beginning or starting, like the universe and humankind. And of course, the nation of Israel is born or has its beginning in the narrative of Genesis. The second interesting background element is the authorship. The Mosaic authorship has been questioned by many scholars, not only the authorship of the book of Genesis, but the entire Pentateuch, the five first books of the Bible. Some scholars only assign to Moses portions of the Pentateuch. However, Moses is consistently identified as the author of the book of Genesis throughout the scriptures. Passages like Deuteronomy 1:8, 2 Kings 13:23, and 1 Chronicles 1:1 all allude to Genesis as part of the Mosaic law or the law of Moses. Also, New Testament passages recognize Moses as the author of the Pentateuch, like I said, the five first books of the Bible or the Torah in the Hebrew tradition. Therefore, I am satisfied with the internal evidence of Moses' authorship, both in the Old and New Testament. I repeat, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the book of Genesis are recognized as of Mosaic authorship. Another background element of the book of Genesis that we can talk about is the date and setting of the book. To date biblical books, it's always a challenge because there are many elements and many factors that have to be taken into consideration. The exact date of the composition of the book of Genesis is not provided in the text, is not provided in the book. However, most commentators believe that Moses wrote the book of Genesis in the wilderness of Sinai sometime right after the Exodus from Egypt in 1445 BC. The setting of the book is going to be expanded when we look at the next background element. There is the theme and purpose of the book. The book reveals how God chose Abraham to start a nation that would bless the whole world. The book was written to help Israel understand their roots and their divine destiny and to build the faith of a previously slave people that they will become, by the power of God, a mighty nation. And that would be the case if they, by faith, depended completely on God. The Joseph stories seem to aim at showing that Jacob and his descendants originally possessed a high standing in Egypt. That has led some commentators to believe that the book of Genesis was put together by Moses as a piece of propaganda, if you may, a way to demonstrate to the Egyptians how unfair and inconsistent was the treatment that they are now giving to the Hebrews in Egypt, because according to the Genesis record, they were welcome in the land of Egypt, and Jacob's family arrived in Egypt with all privileges, and they were blessed by the Pharaoh, and they occupied the position of privilege, and they were totally accepted into the Egyptian culture.
The structure of Genesis is relatively easy to visualize. We can start by dividing the book in two major portions. Chapters 1 through 11, we have what we call primeval history, or the early ages in the history of the world, actually of the universe and the world in which we live in. The second portion of the book, chapters 12 to 50, we have what we call patriarchal history, the history of those men who were responsible and were used by God to bring into birth the nation of Israel. We can subdivide these two major portions And under each one of these main titles or portions, we can have four other sections. Under the primeval history, we have these four major events: creation, fall, flood, and Babel. Under the patriarchal history, we have four people, four characters: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So, the first part of the book, the primeval history, describes all these grand events from the creation to the confusion of the languages, splitting, dividing humanity in different languages, and then they finally spread as God had commanded them to do. The second part of the book, the patriarchal history, it's split in the narratives of the lives, the doings and sayings of the patriarchs of Israel, like I mentioned before: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. There is another way to visualize the book of Genesis to talk about the structure of the book. This is a more scholarly, technical way to look at the book, and is based on the repetition of the expression in the Genesis text. These are the generations of the Hebrew words for Toledoth. So scholars have argued that the book can be divided in these different portions, these different Toledoth, or these different portions in which this expression, these are the generations of, gives us a clue of how the book is structured. So in those days, they wrote in tablets, like the Ten Commandments were given to Moses in two tablets written by God Himself. So I'm not going to go into details, but you can see here what scholars typically have used to describe these different tablets. So we have the creation tablet that describes the creation of the universe, the Adam tablet, the Noah tablet, the tablet of the sons of Noah, the Shem tablet, the Terah tablet, the Ishmael tablet, the Isaac tablet, the Esau tablet, and the Jacob tablet. And each one of these um, tablets or portions of the book that follow this pattern of Toledo, you can see the different components, the title of these tablets, and the history, and when there is or there is not a genealogy detailed. Like I said, this is a technical, scholarly understanding of the structure of the book of Genesis, and it's basically a description of how the book was put together by Moses, utilizing these different Toledoth, or these different generations of in different tablets. The last part of the book, chapters 37 to 50, does not follow the same pattern, because the cultural historical context is different. The historical context and the cultural context of the Joseph stories is Egypt, and so the Toledo pattern is not present, it does not appear there. So I think this will be helpful for you to understand how this book is put together, and how you can identify these different parts that form the structure of the book of Genesis. And as you look at these portions or these parts, you will be able to visualize the book in a way that you can at any time recollect what are the main portions, main elements that comprise the book of Genesis.
The book begins with foundational material on the beginning of the universe, Earth and its environment, the animals, and finally, the crown of creation, human beings. The late British scholar J. Sidlow Baxter has suggested that Genesis 1:1 provides a convincing refutation of 6 false philosophies and worldviews popular throughout history. When we look at the structure of the book of Genesis, we see that the first 11 chapters describe 4 major events. Evidently, the first major event described in the book of Genesis is the creation. The creation of the universe, the creation of planet Earth, the creation of animals and everything that we see around us in nature, and evidently the creation of humankind. In each of these major events, we see different elements or aspects of God's nature operating. When we look at creation, we see God's power. His power to bring about an incredible universe out of nothing. The second event is a tragic event for the history of humankind, in which Adam and Eve, placed in a perfect environment and condition, were required just one act of obedience. They were advised that if they would disobey God, they would suffer the consequences, and that consequence would ultimately be death. We know the rest of the story. We know they did disobey God. However, even in this act of human disobedience, the important thing is to look at God and His nature and how God acts in this situation. And as we look at Genesis chapter 3, we see 2 main attributes of God at play. Number 1, we see His judgment, His righteous judgment over the sin of Adam and Eve, and also of the serpent, the instrument of temptation used by Satan. In this passage, or in this event, we also see God's grace, because God provides something to cover Adam and Eve's nudity, something that they didn't feel any uncomfortable before, but now they are ashamed. And as He provides that, He also makes a promise that one day a descendant of Eve, a descendant of the woman, would come into the world to destroy Satan and to be the savior of the world. The next major event, the flood, is also an event in which God's justice and grace appear. The situation, the condition, the sinfulness of humankind had reached a level that was absolutely impossible for God to just let it go. God had to intervene. And the way he intervened was by destroying every single human life on the planet but for Noah and his family. And at the same time that God is demonstrating his righteousness, he is also demonstrating his grace as he provided Noah and his family and a sample of the animals, ark, a perfect safe place for them to ride out the storm, if we may. The final event in this first portion of the book of Genesis is Babel. Again, we see humankind acting. And we see humankind acting in pride and in disobedience. They decided to stop at a certain point in their journey to repopulate the earth. And they found a place, they liked it, and they said, let's establish ourselves here. Let's build a city. Let's build a tower in the center of the city that will reach to heaven. God looked at that, and God saw that that was an act of disobedience because God had told Noah and his descendants to repopulate the earth. So God comes into play and he provides a means to stop that human movement. And in doing so, he is exercising both his justice and his grace. He is exercising his justice by preventing them to continue that path there was in disobedience and challenging his command. But by doing so, he is also expresses his grace because as he split humanity in different peoples and different languages, he prevented humanity to be so strong as they wanted to be at that point that it would be just impossible to predict what human beings would decide to do if they were that strong. As we have seen, the second part of the book of Genesis deals with the lives of 4 men who are called the patriarchs. They are those men God used to bring into existence the nation of Israel. The first of these 4 characters, of course, is Abraham, to whom God first made a promise that he would be blessed and he would have a great descendancy and that his descendants would bless all the earth. Abraham can be described as a man who believed God for the impossible. Abraham believed God was faithful to his promise. He stepped out in faith and followed God's leading. He believed that God would do what he promised. It was not always easy for him to believe, but in the end, God honored him for his faith. However, Abraham did not start well. Twice he lied and placed his wife Sarah in a very dangerous and awkward condition or position because he feared for his life. As time passed and God's promise of a descendant seemed out of reach, he accepted Sarah's unwise suggestion and had a son with one of his servants with the hope that that son would fulfill God's promise. Despite his wavering faith, God remained faithful to his promise, and Abraham eventually demonstrated a mature faith as he was willing to even sacrifice his own son in obedience to God. This is how the book of Hebrews describes Abraham's faith. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his own and only son. Even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive his Isaac back from death. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19. Abraham's son, Isaac, was the one that, according to God's will and God's plan and God's promise, would give birth to the nation of Israel. We can describe Isaac as a man who accepted God's sovereignty. Isaac is one of those characters in the Bible who seem to have had a good life. Isaac married a woman whom he loved. He saw God answer his prayer concerning children. He had 2 healthy sons and became wealthy. God continued to bless him throughout his life. But as we look at his life, we see Isaac as an unknowing and unwilling participant in the deceptive plans of others who were very close to him. However, Isaac accepted God's sovereignty, even though it must have been painful for him to realize what had transpired. Isaac's son, Jacob, was chosen by God to continue the process of bringing into existence a nation that would be God's special nation. We can describe Jacob as the man who finished strong. If you had to choose someone for an important task, would you prefer a liar? Someone willing to deceive those closest to him? Or a self-centered person? Probably not. Strangely enough, that's precisely what God did. That reminds us that God's ways are not our ways. It gives us hope, great hope, to know that God could use someone like Jacob. He started off questionable, to say the least. He deceived his brother twice. He was forced to flee his home to avoid his brother's wrath, just wrath in a sense. But God brought good out of this bad situation. By leaving his home, he met God on the way. Jacob's life was indeed a roller coaster spiritual journey, but we see God's hand on him every step of the way. He started out as a deceiving, self-centered young man. But once he came face to face with God, his life was never the same again. Even his name had to be changed to match his life change, and now he is called Israel. God took an imperfect man, changed him, and used him to fulfill his promises to Abraham. The next character described in detail in the book of Genesis is Joseph. We can call Joseph a man with a divine purpose. We can say that Joseph had many things going his way in life. He was handsome, the first son born to Israel through Rachel, the woman he loved, and consequently he was his father's favorite son. He also had great dreams pointing to a successful future. However, one day his entire life changed. He was forced to leave his comfortable life, the life that he had known for so many years, a life full of love from his parents, and had to go forth into the unknown. How frightening that must have been for a 17-year-old boy. Joseph was thrown in a pit, sold to traders, taken to Egypt, made a slave in Potiphar's house, falsely accused, convicted of attempted rape, and put into prison. In prison, he was forgotten. Joseph lived a life of integrity and was faithful to God amid prosperity and adversity. He kept a proper perspective when he was wronged by others and had to pay unjustified consequences. Yet God had his hand on Joseph. God has a purpose for this young man. Joseph didn't know why God had chosen this path for his life until later, yet he never seemed to waver. God was always in control. Joseph kept his eyes on God, and God used Joseph greatly.